Good evening. How are you all this evening? It's been quite a day in the United States of America. I couldn't turn off NPR while I was driving here from Des Moines today. I am so appreciative of the invitation to be with you all tonight. Laura, thank you so much for that introduction and for giving us a context for tonight to talk about larger questions of peace. I want to thank the Sisters of St. Francis for inviting me and the Franciscan Peace Center. It's really an honor to especially, I spent a lot of my time in both educational spaces, and so this college context feels very familiar to me, but also a lot of time with Protestants. And I'm just really, in a humbled way, appreciative of being invited into this space because, of course, so many in the Catholic Church traditions have just really led the way on questions of peace and justice and active nonviolence. And so I really feel kind of a humble awe that I would be invited to address you tonight. So thank you for that. And I just want to say that it's appropriate that we're going to talk about race and racism because, of course, racism is a form of violence. And I know I don't have to tell you this, but that if we want to seek peace, we have to root out the injustice that is itself a form of violence. And in the United States of America, one of the most pernicious forms of that is white supremacy and racism that is rooted in our history. And so what I want to do this evening is to talk a little bit with you. I want to share a story about the church, and because of my own upbringing and formation in the Baptist church tradition in the United States, the story I'm going to tell you really comes out of Protestant movements in the United States. I'm going to be very interested to get to dialogue with you about other traditions, the Catholic tradition in the United States, but even though I'm talking about Protestantism tonight, a story that comes out of Protestant traditions, the story I'm going to tell actually has non-religious versions too. The story I tell has higher education versions. The story I'm going to tell has political versions, because I want to tell a story tonight about the civil rights movement and the ways that we have really whitewashed that story and what that means for how we understand questions of justice and, of course, the way justice pertains to peace. So I want to start that conversation tonight by offering for our collective sort of discernment for a moment, two statements that were made by the incredible rebellious Miss Rosa Parks, who is an appropriate figure to begin with on a day where we're thinking about issues of peace. So I want to share this statement that Parks made in 1971 to a reporter. To a reporter, Miss Rosa Parks said this: "Regardless of whether or not any one person may know what to do about segregation and oppression, it's better to protest than to accept injustice." Okay? 6 years before that, Miss Rosa Parks had said this to someone. She said, "I'm in favor of any move to show we are dissatisfied." So I need to tell you that I was a little surprised when I read these statements by Miss Rosa Parks several years ago, because in neither of those statements that I just read to you was Parks talking about the power of nonviolent resistance. This Parks that I just quoted is actually a very different Rosa Parks than the Parks that we have long held captive in kind of one dimension in U.S. memory of her, as if she's still sitting on a bus. The first statement I read to you, Parks was actually, in a rather grief-filled way, talking about the riots and the rebellions of Detroit in 1967. And in the second statement I read to you, Parks was, we have to take a little bit of a breath for this one, I think. She was actually reiterating her belief in the right to self-defense. When I first read that, I did a bit of an intellectual double take. Like, the right to self-defense? From the mother of the movement known for turning the other cheek? And Parks giving support to Detroit citizens when they were breaking glass and setting buildings on fire, seeming to have given up on nonviolent resistance? And the answer to that question is yes. Among many things that is little known about Rosa Parks' life is her very complex take on the question of nonviolence. Parks was actually closer to Malcolm X on this question than she was to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on this question. Parks felt deep despair about the riots and the fires and the rebellions in Detroit because she knew that the fires there in 1967 were more harmful to black neighborhoods and African American communities and businesses than they were actually successful in reining in white violence. But Rosa Parks believed that even then, and she was very clear about this because white journalists asked her this question all the time. They really wanted her to condemn the violence of those protesters. Parks was clear that if white supremacy, if racism was, the chokehold of racism was so tight that the only thing a community could do was set fires in that form of rebellion, then so be it. She believed that that form of resistance was better than quietly living with injustice. I have to say, echoes of the kinds of ways that pacifist Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about the sin of violence, and then, he was a pacifist who also then tried to help participate in a plot to assassinate Hitler. And yet he was a pacifist. That kind of echoes for me in this commentary from Parks. She was just clear. Any move to show we are dissatisfied. Any move to show we are dissatisfied. So we're going to wrestle with a question together this evening. And for me, this question really comes down to this. Okay, so now what? Now what? And here's the reason for that question. We have seen in this country since starting in August of 2014, all across the nation, many of us woke up to images that have since become kind of seared in our collective memory. Ferguson, Missouri, which was a place most of us had never heard of. Before that month, in August of 2014, it was on fire. And there was a young person there named Michael Brown. He had been killed by a police officer. And after that, an eruption had followed. And for days and weeks afterwards, I don't know if you took in these images on the news, but I certainly did. I work with college students. I work with African American and Latino college students in a very deep way. We were just riveted with horror because these images of tanks in the streets and children being tear gassed and police locked arm in arm in riot gear and assault rifles aimed at young, often non-violently protesting black people, sometimes accompanied by clergy. These images just kind of cycled through the news stream. And the most eerie part for some of us, I think, was that except for the fact that those images were in color, those pictures that came out of Ferguson in 2014, they looked a lot like they could have come out of Selma in 1964, didn't they? I see folks nodding their heads. Or Rochester, New York in 1965. Or Detroit in 1967. And so since that time, of course, in the months and years since Ferguson, so many other names, so many other places have also come to echo their devastation in our public discourses. Cleveland and 12-year-old Tamir Rice, Charleston and Mother Emanuel AME Church, Waller County and Sandra Bland. We don't have enough time to list all the names and places. And in my journey and the work that I do, I have found myself since 2014, I think, really surrounded by many, many Americans who've seemed stunned by everything that's been unfolding in this nation since 2014. But I've noticed that for my white sisters and brothers, the kind of stunned I have heard has seemed like a kind of surprise. Like it's had a coating of disbelief. I've heard questions like this. What? We're still this racially alienated? What is going on? Why are youth setting fire in Ferguson, Missouri? We still live in worlds this different from one another? What do we do with this? How do we make sense of this? And all of that was before November of 2016. Since November of 2016, those questions, I've heard them continue, but they've intensified, but now they sound more like this. How did this happen? Who did this? So in the same period of time, my sisters and brothers of color have also seemed stunned by what began to unfold in Ferguson in 2014 and on since. But the stunned that I have heard expressed by my brothers and sisters of color has not been the stunned of surprised or shocked. It has been a stunned that is more deeply inflected with a kind of outrage and a kind of very, very tired but fierce despair. It has sounded more like this, what I have heard in African American and Latino communities, both like in the school that I work in, churches I get to engage with. It sounded more like this. Enough. Basta. Black Lives Matter. And since November 2016, especially in mainline Protestant churches where I spend a lot of time, I've heard this. What do you mean, who did this? Have you read the voting demographics? We have been trying to get your attention on this for so very long. So it's in this really difficult context tonight that I want to talk a little bit about the civil rights story that we have long been telling in this nation, and in many ways in Christian contexts have continued to tell since the 1960s. And it's a story that has some inadequacies to it that have underprepared us for the moment that we're facing. And I started with Rosa Parks because it's my belief that if we can tell a more complete story about the civil rights movement, we actually would find the ground we need to be on to fight for peace and justice in the present and for the generations to come. So I want to start the story that I want to share first, which is, I'm going to prepare you a painful story because it's so, it's got so much brokenness in it, by asking you this question. I am wondering if any of you have ever heard the claim, 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour of the week. Have you heard that claim? Okay, a good number of you. I've probably preached that claim, actually. I've probably preached that from a pulpit in my day. This is, of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1960s claim. And while it might be more accurate today to talk about separation instead of segregation, those are not exactly the same thing. If we just take that statement at demographic face value, it's actually statistically still true. Christians of all denominations in this country worship in spaces as racially distinct today as we did before the civil rights movement. Not just since the civil rights movement ended, before it even happened. And this statement shows up, especially among Christians, because we lament this truth. This statement seems to us that if we're worshiping in separate spaces, this is evidence of sin and brokenness in the human condition. It must mean somehow that we are resistant to difference, that we're not celebrating diversity well enough. Racial separation seems to us evidence of dislike or maybe even mistrust. And so in response to that lament, we have many times, very logically I think, made working for interracial togetherness a primary way that we talk about race. And so we've used words like, we are one in Christ, we are all part of the body of God, we lift up metaphors of family, we emphasize that God's creation is beautiful, all of it in its diversity. And the word we use that has a theological resonance to it is reconciliation. We love to use the word reconciliation in Christian spaces to talk about coming together across these painful lines of brokenness that are all over our communities. And it's certainly, again, not just a people of faith challenge or crisis. It's a national challenge and crisis. I see it at Drake University, and I see it in my American Baptist denomination. It's the same problem, but there we talk about it as reconciliation, and here we talk about it as inclusion. We just use different words, but we've got the same brokenness in both places. So I like to call this, this commitment to interracial togetherness, this reconciliation, I like to call it a reconciliation paradigm. And the reason I like to do that is because the word paradigm signals something different that's important. These are progressives. I'm about to turn, I'm 2 years from 50. When I was 45, I'd never worn glasses before in my life. All of a sudden I was doing this with my phone and other things, and next thing I knew I was wearing readers, okay? I've quickly every year needed a new prescription since. I've long since accepted that, but the reason I use the word paradigm is because a paradigm is like glasses. When I first got these readers, when I turned about 45, I realized that the shape and the size of the frame determined what I could see. And so that's what a paradigm does. It doesn't just predetermine what kinds of answers we give to questions. It actually decides ahead of time what questions we think are important. I can't even take seriously some stuff written on my page up here if my frame doesn't include it. And so I like to talk about a reconciliation paradigm because I am not here to disavow reconciliation as a longing. The second part of the title of my book is for those of us still longing for racial reconciliation. I long for a racially reconciled church. I long to be living in a racially reconciled civic community. I long for racial reconciliation in this nation some days so badly my bones ache. But what I am clear about is that a reconciliation paradigm, a framing of the question of race, around the question of interracial togetherness primarily, if we just can get together across racial lines, we'll be fine, we can achieve peace and justice, that I'm fairly confident that that paradigm has failed us in this country, both in higher ed versions and in faith community contexts. And in fact, I think that the reconciliation paradigm failed us long before Ferguson was set on fire, and that we can actually talk about and identify the ways and the reasons it's failed us, which can help us actually get really serious about responses to those failures. And so that's why this story of the civil rights movement I want to tell is so important. So there's a number of different problems that show up in reconciliation paradigms, but here is the big one. Reconciliation as a paradigm, it rests on this basic assumption about difference. And that assumption goes like this. I, as a white US American person, I need to come to better appreciate and love and embrace and celebrate your blackness, your Native Americanness, your Latino-ness, and you need to come to better embrace and celebrate my whiteness. Ooh, see how that, people, like, when I say things like that in class, my students are like, oh, no, Dr. Harvey, don't say that. It's like a two-legged stool, right? It's a morally incoherent kind of basic assumption. And we can talk in the discussion about what we do with that, about the fact that whiteness is not celebratable in that way. That's a whole other important moral, ethical, political question. But when we talk about reconciliation, we are invoking a framework, a paradigm that it's morally incoherent. Not because we want it to be, but just it is. But nonetheless, in Protestant spaces, at least, we have explicitly committed ourselves to this reconciliation paradigm for decades now. And so we have produced volumes of Christian ed material calling for sacred dialogue across racial lines. We have consistently framed questions of justice, which again is at the heart of peacemaking. We've framed those as, how can we make an inclusive, welcoming church? And when we say that, what we mean is a church where we are together across lines of racial difference, okay? Now again, I am not here to disavow being together across lines of racial difference. I want to live in a robustly mutual justice-filled multiracial world. That's what I want. But there's a failure when we use a reconciliation paradigm to talk about how we're going to get there. So, before I tell the story, I want to say that there are deeply sacred, truly sacred, historical and theological precedents for this focus on reconciliation. It comes directly from the courageous and oh-so-brilliant civil rights movement. It specifically comes, of course, from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. King articulated a vision of beloved community, not just for the church, but for the nation, and really for the globe, right? And that is a sacred historical and theological precedent that I want to honor. My quibble is not with Dr. King. My quibble is with what white U.S. Americans have done with Dr. King's work. But part of what happened is that white Christians who were active in civil rights, some of us, or who watched the movement's brilliance and courage and vision as children and got captivated by that vision, lots of justice-committed, liberally inclined, or maybe even progressive white Christians over time, sometimes whole denominations, bought into this vision of beloved community. And beloved community has just like gripped the white Protestant mind ever since. It's the way, it's the paradigm through which we talk about race. And the problem with that is, again, not the vision, it's that the way that the paradigm rests on that two-legged stool also comes out of a very whitewashed civil rights story that most of us don't know. And so what I want to offer this evening is a couple undertold parts of the actual story. And I think that this story is something we need desperately today, because you and I together right now, as we sit in this room, I know I don't have to tell you this, we are living in days, we're living through something, aren't we? I mean, right now, there are people testifying about why it's not okay to have a Muslim ban. I heard that on the news today. We're having that conversation. We are living in days where Latino families are literally being terrorized. We are living in days where black children are being brutalized and brown babies are sleeping on concrete floors at the behest of our government. And this is a very, very, very frightening time. We're going to be living, however any elections come out in any county or state legislature or national election in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, we're going to be living with the repercussions of this era as justice-committed peacemakers for decades to come. And that is very difficult. But we have also seen, I've seen them firsthand, I've been in there with some of them, we have seen beautiful, diverse movements and mobilizations and resistance also happening across this country, across the land. We've had hundreds of thousands of people, including lots of white folks who've never done that before, get into the streets and say, no, no more. We have seen Jewish communities shutting down ICE operations. We have seen faith leaders of all different denominations, ecumenical gatherings, interfaith gatherings, traveling to the southern border, bearing prophetic witness there. We've seen congregations creating sanctuary networks and hanging Black Lives Matter signs on their buildings. We even have a very raucous argument going on about racism in our most sacred arena of national life, the National Football League, right? I know, I don't watch it either. But my friends, at the center of all of this diverse and powerful mobilization that has been so critically important for so many of us to be involved in these very desperate, difficult days, at the center of this diverse set of mobilizations, there's an open question that I think we are facing as a nation right now. And here's the question. Can we turn all of this justice-committed momentum and resistance into sustained anti-white supremacy, pro-Black, brown, Native, Asian American lives movements, ones that of course include Muslim and Jewish lives as well? Can we do that? And I think our collective future depends on how we can answer that question. And so I believe we need to remember and learn, or re-remember and relearn, a more truthful civil rights story, one that can help us answer a yes to that question. And that story that I want us to remember begins with the fires that Parks was talking about. That's where it starts. Because the thing is, if we want a civil rights story where we decide that reconciliation, that's the takeaway point, that's what we need to move forward into the decades post-civil rights, we actually have to be willing to say that the civil rights movement ended in like 1964. Which is very early. I don't think any of us would have said, if I said as you walked in, when did the civil rights movement end? What would you have said? Late 60s, early 70s, maybe 68 with King's assassination. Nobody would have said 1964, probably. But that's what we have to be willing to say. If the most important thing we learned, as Christians included, is that reconciliation is the call. We have to say, well, yeah, because the civil rights movement ended in 1964. The reason we would have to say that is because by the mid-1960s, Black Power movements had already started to express disappointment with civil rights, the traditional iteration of the movement. Because as early as 1964, riots and fires had consumed Rochester, New York. And those rebellions had been triggered by police violence against black communities. And organizers there said, look, our problem isn't segregation. Our problem isn't the right to vote. It's access to jobs. And by the time fires consumed Detroit in 1967, Black Power had really critiqued mainstream civil rights analysis of the actual national racial situation, as well as mainstream civil rights solutions for it. I would, just as an aside, say I think King starting to move that direction is partly what ended up getting him in more trouble. He definitely got in hotter and hotter water the more he sort of had an ear for these kinds of arguments. And what we need to know is, of course, Black Power activists in the late 60s were not hostile to the idea that everyone should have legal equality. They were not. But they were very clear that equal rights was not the panacea for the diverse and complex and specific ways that oppression and subjugation impacted black communities. It wasn't going to be the fix. And Black Power, this part's a little harder, was particularly critical then of this notion of beloved community. Because in Black Power's analysis, the problem wasn't segregation, for which you fix it by focusing on integration or diversity, if you're in higher ed, or reconciliation if you're in Protestant spaces. All of these are echoes of that 11 o'clock lament. Oh, we're so segregated, let's reconcile. That wasn't the problem in Black Power's analysis. The problem was white power and systemic exploitation. And by the mid-1960s, Black Power had shown up in Christian contexts. And here's 4 little snippets from this undertold story that, I'll tell you, I'm a child of the church. I was born and raised in the church. I've never left, though my journey has taken me to different parts of the Christian world. I didn't learn this story until I was already done with my Master of Divinity degree in seminary. I encountered it when I was a PhD student at Union Seminary, and I thought, why am I only now learning this story? Here's a couple parts of the story I want to share with you. First, the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity. This is a group that went by the acronym ESCRU. This was one of the most important civil rights groups in the church. And ESCRU accomplished many important things, but one of ESCRU's goals in the 60s was to end all single race parishes. This makes sense. Think back to that paradigm. If you believe the most significant problem with single race parishes is that they're evidence of the sin of segregation, then integration or work to realize beloved community or reconciliation, that becomes your focus. That's how you frame it. So ESCRU's reconciliation couldn't see the difference between a black-led, all-black parish and a white-led, all-white parish. Those are not the same thing. ESCRU couldn't see, though, that they were not the same thing. And so ESCRU actively supported the Episcopal Church in closing down black parishes that were financially struggling over and over again and just integrating them into white parishes. This was a civil rights goal Krewe laid out. It was totally consistent with the reconciliation paradigm, right? That's framed the problem is we're not together, so we're gonna put us together. By the mid-1960s, African American priests who had been central in Krewe's work, who had been ardent supporters of integration, these were folks who'd worked side by side with white Episcopalians in this work, they realized Krewe's advocacy was eroding their power in the denomination, and so they moved out. By '68, they had left, and they founded the Union of Black Clergy and Laity, a group that still exists in some parts of the denomination. The second example I want to share with you comes from the National Council of Churches, which had a commission on race and religion. It still does, actually. And this group also was very effective in its first 2 years. Black and white Christians were very active together in it. But a church historian, James Finley, says that by '65, the National Council of Churches Commission on Race and Religion, which was charged with working on the civil rights agenda of the churches, 65, the commission had lost steam, he writes. In part, he said that white laity quit showing up to support civil rights after 1964. Voting rights had been one thing, but when the issues became jobs and economic resources, they were much less enthusiastic. And in part, black Christians were publicly expressing frustration at how white-led the commission was, and how it had failed to include African Americans in its decision-making. And so, in '65, Benjamin Peyton was named the first African American director of the commission, and he started his tenure by saying this. Now I'm quoting him. He said, "The rights which have been couched in law," that is civil rights talk, "are now being sought in life as practical social and economic matters." That's black power talk in the church. And a year later, he called black members of the National Churches Commission to form their own group, and they did. They birthed the National Committee of Black Churchmen. Third example from this story, that same year, 1966, the National Committee of Black Churchmen, this group that Benjamin Peyton brought into being, published a statement in the New York Times and in the Chicago Tribune, and in this public statement, the NCBC raised concerns about Dr. King's strategies, questioned the commitment of King's white Christian supporters, and made a theological case for black power. So as black power became more and more compelling among black Christians, what happened was alienation between whites and blacks became more and more pronounced, because white Christians who had been active allies in civil rights completely rejected black power, wanted nothing to do with it. So finally, last part of this story, in 1969, on the heels of the devastating assassination of King, devastating assassination, probably some of you remember, on the heels of the Kerner Commission's report, which said that white racism is the cause of urban rebellions. Cities are on fire because of white racism, not because black people are violent. White racism is the cause of these fires. And other disappointments with the movement, the Poor People's Campaign, which was faltering. An activist by the name of James Foreman, with grassroots support from across many parts of the black community, interrupted worship at the Riverside Church in New York City, New York, Manhattan, on May 4th, 1969. This year was the 50-year anniversary, if that's the right word, of this event. And there, Foreman read from the pulpit the Black Manifesto. And the Black Manifesto began like this. I won't read the whole thing. It said, "We, the black people assembled in Detroit, Michigan, are fully aware that we've been forced to come together because racist white America has exploited our resources, our minds, our bodies, our labor. We are demanding $500 million from the Christian white churches. This is not a large sum of money. We know that the churches have a tremendous wealth, and its membership, white America, has profited from and still exploits black people. $15 for every black brother and sister in the United States is only a beginning of the reparations due us as people who have been exploited and degraded, brutalized, killed, and persecuted. And the manifesto went on to list very specific initiatives that the $500 million would go to. Initiatives designed to shift power, to shift power, to shift power. Now, what's important that we know is that not only had black clergy and laity helped create the Black Manifesto, in the months after this event at Riverside Church, the manifesto's demands were roundly endorsed by black clergy and laity in Protestant churches. And I probably don't have to tell you, if white Christians had disparaged black power, we positively excoriated the Black Manifesto. We ran from demands being made by our fellow Christians with much more fervor and passion than we had ever run toward civil rights. And so, if any doubt had remained if our work would be difficult to realize, beloved community, if there was doubt about that, that doubt became gone by the end of the civil rights movement, because white Christians who'd been happy to talk about reconciliation, happy to talk about integration, became hostile when talk turned towards concrete forms of repair. And so, racial alienation came to rule the day. Same church historian James Finley says that by the early 70s, he writes, quote, "Everywhere there were signs of disruption and decline in the old coalitions and friendships between whites and blacks in the churches." He claims that the era of the Black Manifesto left black and white Christians more alienated than we had been prior to this whole civil rights movement. And we really need to notice that, as painful as it may be, because it's precisely counter how we tell our civil rights story. When we tell a story that emphasizes how much better things got to be among and between us because of civil rights, even when we acknowledge that we still have a long ways to go, which I think the church does acknowledge that, we're literally telling a whitewashed version of it, because that's not what happened. And so we desperately need this story. And we need it now, more now today, I think, than we've ever perhaps needed it before, and I'm going to tell you why that is. It's not that the civil rights movement accomplished nothing. It's not that it wasn't courageous and brilliant. It did accomplish many things, and it was courageous and brilliant. It is not that black power movements were perfect. They were most assuredly not. But at the end of the day, the critiques that black power movements made, and many other power movements too, actually, Chicana power movements, Native American power movements of various kinds, the critique that power movements made starting in the mid-1960s, passionately and repeatedly, more than 50 years ago now, from both within and outside the walls of Christianity, so lots of Christians were part of power movements. Those critiques were proven deadly accurate by all of those fires in the late 1960s. And at the end of the day, I do believe black power's critiques remained actually pretty terrifyingly predictive of so many of the events we have seen unfolding in this nation, from Ferguson to Mother Emanuel Church 2015, to a racism-infused public discourse around the last presidential election, 2016, to neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville in 2017, to the well-documented rise of white nationalism in our nation in 2018 and beyond. It turns out we should not have been surprised by any of this. We should not have been. But the reason that we may have been is because we have so often carried forward reconciliation, beloved community, this way of talking about the civil rights movement and our current work on race and racism and discrimination. We've done that as if those critiques of our siblings of color never happened in the 1960s. We just acted like that never happened. We've held on to reconciliation as a paradigm, and we have ignored or forgotten or marginalized, and sometimes even, repudiated publicly, calls for repair and the shift of power and resources and redress. Calls that, in fact, have said to us in the church or in non-faith-based spaces where there's a commitment to justice, or in higher education where we have all kinds of racial disparities hovering around, calls that said, it's not about a reconciliation paradigm. It's about a paradigm of repair. We've got to repair. So I believe that There's good reasons those images that came out of Ferguson in 2014 looked so much like the images of Selma in 1965. And that is that if the Civil Rights Act of '64, if that was the national response to incredible civil rights organizing, and it was incredible organizing, the response to urban rebellions and the clarity of Black power movements has mostly been silence and denial. And to the extent that the analyses Black power offered the nation and communities within the nation, congregations within the nation, organizations within the nation who are committed to peace and justice, to the extent those analyses have never gotten a serious public hearing or informed in a meaningful way our economic and social and political and religious initiatives, we as a nation, we're actually caught in very much the same racial realities we were caught in the late 1960s. I think it turns out that we are actually the ones who've remained pretty captive sitting frozen on a bus. And Rosa Parks, she was not. She never did stay on that bus. Rosa Parks lost her job after she sat down. She was set aside in some complicated ways by the very iconic male leaders of the civil rights movement. She spent years after that bus stand living in poverty and food insecurity. She was physically malnourished because she didn't have enough money to buy food. She experienced serious health problems, including heart problems, connected with her poverty. And yet she continued to work, as she had before that bus stand, with the youth, with the poor, with working class peoples, and even with people accused of communism. All groups that mainstream civil rights were wary of. And Rosa Parks was also an ardent admirer of Black power movements. She was active in Black nationalist movements in the 1970s. I didn't know that until a couple of years ago. Maybe you did. Young nationalist organizers in the 70s would say, man, that Miss Rosa Parks, she is always there. She always shows up. She showed up for the same movements that so many of us never learned about or have forgotten about or we've written out by actively or passively of our national civil rights story. So, if reconciliation is the takeaway point for the civil rights story that we usually tell, the more complex, much more truthful version of a civil rights story that goes past 1964, that includes power movements, is repair. Maybe even reparations. It's a reparations paradigm or a repair paradigm. The truth is, Black Christians by the late 60s weren't asking anymore to sit down with white Christians and talk. They just weren't. They were demanding that white U.S. American Christians repent and repair. They were calling us to take seriously the material, economic, financial relationships that our identity as white put us in relative to communities of color. And they were insisting that we respond to our structural location and the history we inherited in a society still organized so hierarchically and so violently that reconciliation had started to sound more like resounding gongs or clanging cymbals, which the Apostle Paul talks about in the New Testament is something we should be wary of. So, I want to say this. I realize that this is a very painful story to hear, but I want to say in a very clear way, because I believe it's true, that I think actually this story has the greatest possible hope in it in this moment in our history, learning this fuller story, not because of the despair that it induces, but because this is precisely the line of the story we need to better understand race, racial difference, and racism, because I believe that our ability right now in this country, as we are mobilizing for peace and justice and a vision of a different, not just a different future, a different tomorrow, a different today, right? Our ability to create a truly liberative vision for the future depends on us getting the interrelationships between all these diverse actors, these diverse peoples, these diverse communities, getting it correct, or those coalitions won't work in the long term. And at the heart of doing that is the urgency of getting the race part correct, which is something that over and over again the church, for all its wonderfulness and best intentions, has really failed to do in a sustained way. And at the heart of getting the race part correct, if we're really honest, is getting the white part of the race part correct. The flip side of that difficult challenge, then the reason I have so much hope is that I think if we get it correct, movements for peace and justice would be unstoppable. we'd be unstoppable. Because think about all the constituencies and communities impacted by racism and colonial settlerism and the xenophobia that's impacting us. Really, if we could get it correct and stick together, we'd be in the majority and we would win for peace and justice. Are you allowed to talk about winning for peace? That sounds kind of violent, actually. I don't mean it that way. Like, we would grow the vision for peace and justice, but we have to get the white part correct, or those coalitions will not be sustainable. So that's why we want this story, as hard as it is to hear. That's why this story gives me hope. So the question remains for me, now what? Now what do we do? This more truthful account of our own civil rights history lays at our feet, I think, whether in organizations, congregations, parishes, institutions, communities, neighborhoods, wherever we live and work and play, that we move towards repair-based movements for understanding race, instead of diversity and reconciliation and dialogue-focused framing of the issues. Which is not me saying don't talk to each other. We need to talk, but we need repair-based framing of the problem. In contrast to the confusion that reconciliation so often creates in that two-legged stool, a repair paradigm is really clarifying. It helps us actually understand our relationships, our racial identities, what we mean to one another in historical terms. Or in the city of Des Moines, I understand my relationship to Black Des Moinesites better when I recognize there's incredible moral, economic, political debt. Repair that is owed to Black people in Des Moines because of what the city of Des Moines has done in the last 50 years to decimate the economic base of Black communities. That requires me to engage in reparative work, not call for interracial togetherness so that we can talk. In contrast to the ambiguous work of reconciliation, a repair paradigm can help us identify much more clearly the paths we need to walk to respond to our actual racial situation, pathways that would be far more truthful and productive, I think, and life-giving than any paths we've been able to find so far in using reconciliation as our framework. Unlike reconciliation, reparations is unquestionably morally coherent. It doesn't fall apart on a two-legged stool. And maybe most importantly for me, because I am a Baptist after all, a reparations or a repair paradigm is also biblical. It's biblical. I know this story is hard, but I know in my temptations to despair sometimes that I must resist, because I actually believe that from the biblical witness, so I'm putting on my preacher hat for a moment, that repentance from sin, in meaningful repentance from sin, the possibility of new life comes. And I know this for many reasons. Probably what I'm holding on to most right now is because I know the story of Zacchaeus. You remember Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was liberated. We shouldn't fear repair talk. He starts out afraid and broken, and then he comes down out of that tree. Jesus calls him down, and he gives away half his wealth he had earned through complicity in an unjust system. It wasn't his money, but he had it. He gave it back half of that to the poor, and to anyone he had stolen through complicity in that system, folks he had cheated, he gave back fourfold. That's reparations. He gave it back fourfold. And then what did he do? He got to go home with Jesus. Baptists really want to go home with Jesus. That's where I want to go. And so, I've been telling some church communities, let's take off our WWJD bracelets. What would Jesus do? I'm going to have for white Christians in the United States of America, WWZD bracelets. What would Zacchaeus do? He's our guy. If we follow him, do what he did, we're going to go home with Jesus. That's where we want to go. So, if we long for racial reconciliation like I do, if we long for peace and justice when it comes to the impact and violence of racism, I believe we have to stop making interracial togetherness the way we frame the work. And instead we need to learn these more complicated stories of our own interracial legacies, the harm that's there, the repair that is required, not only from the histories from themselves, but the ways that we have not always told the truth about those histories. Histories where our brothers and sisters of color have said to white communities over and over again, if you want to be our allies, if you want to be with us, you've got to repent and repair. That's your part in this shared work of multiracial peace and justice making. It's not easy work, repair work. It doesn't immediately make obvious exactly what we're supposed to do. It's difficult work, it's uncertain, but it's sacred work. And I think now is the moment for it. And the church, all the iterations of the church, could lead on this in this country right now. If we told this very new but oh so old sacred story that begins for some of us with repentance and repair. So I believe we can walk a different path. I have hope about that path, even though I don't know exactly what the steps are. But I also think we must walk down that different path. And so I'm going to close by quoting the amazing, rebellious, and relentless Rosa Parks when she said, "It's time to make any move to show we are dissatisfied." Thank you. We're going to do questions. You what? Okay.
Other questions?
I'm happy to engage any question, even questions of disagreement or pushback, as long as we respect each other as we engage. So I love to have some dialogue about where this lands with you. So when I use the word repair, or even reparations, I know reparations makes folks feel a little bit more on edge sometimes. What I think about, I'll give a couple examples. A truth-telling and repair process, for example, that in slightly different forums, because South Africa was on the brink of a civil war, that's why they had the Truth and Reconciliation process, and it sort of that informed the logic by which they did it. But in the big picture, a process where truth-telling and accounting historically, and an accounting for how the history is causing racial harm in the present, that is, I would say, instead of a truth and reconciliation process, such as they had in South Africa, we would call it a truth and repair process, because it would be a journey where, a little bit like Japanese American redress unfolded, where there's public hearings or convened forums where folks told their stories, and we had a public hearing and account, not only for the human trauma and violence and the experiences of people. If we're talking about reparations for enslavement, then we're of course talking about people of African descent. But also then that involved an economic assessment of what the unjust enrichment has been and what the vestiges of that injustice still is in, for example, in this case, Black communities. And so absolutely a truth and repair process would be broader than just money, but in my view, would, if it's just, have to involve resource redistribution. So personally, when I've been amazed to hear the word reparations be floated in our political discourse, which doesn't mean make me think we're sort of going to get there tomorrow, but that's a huge shift to have that word being uttered by folks that are running for office, even if I'm not even sure they even know why they're saying it. But, and that's a product of lots of activists working on that. So I'll give you two other more localized examples. There are groups like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is probably a group you're familiar with. I mean, so committed to global peace, right? Active nonviolence. Fellowship of Reconciliation right now has launched in the last year it's called the Fellowship of Reconciliation Truth and Reparations Campaign. And they are trying to get local communities, Dave Ragland is the organizer, they're trying to get local communities to engage locally on truth-telling relative to various communities' involvement in the long, long, long legacies of enslavement. So that's an example, and they're trying to use that to build a campaign to support the other mobilizations that are happening about reparations for enslavement. Having said that, I think repair and reparations can also take many different forms than that. So for example, in my institution where I teach, we have what I think of as a reparations-based model for engaging students of color in our campus environment. Like many institutions, we have long had significant racial disparities in our graduation rates between white students and students of color, especially Black and Latino students, in students who did graduate, GPA gap, and we knew, because we finally crunched the data about 10 years ago, that students who were showing, where racial disparities were showing up, it wasn't about pre-college preparation. That is a separate issue that sometimes is real in life for students because of differential access to quality K through 12 education. But we knew that we measured white students with the same high school prep and ACT scores, their academic outcomes versus Black students and Latino students who had the same high school college prep and test scores, and the disparities were showing up there too. And so we were like, aha. In higher ed, we tend to think we have this deficit model for thinking about students of color, and we think something's wrong with them, and we need to help them excel. What we realized when we crunched the data, I mean, we knew that was wrong, ideologically, that framing, but when you could see the data, it was like, oh no, something's happening to them at Drake. Drake has a deficit. Drake is doing something to these students, and let's call it racial harm, because that's what's happening. There is something happening here in the institution. That means these students that are just as equipped are not graduating, or are graduating with less academic excellence under their belt, right? Their GPA gaps aren't reflecting it. Well, what we realized, there's all kinds of places, we started then figuring out where many of the racial harms were happening, and it's all over the institution. And so we designed a program, the program that Laura mentioned I co-direct, called the Krewe Scholars Program, and it's a repair-based program. It's a cohort model program. Students get a big tuition support. It's for students of color, domestic students of color. And basically, instead of bringing students to Drake and saying, okay, we're gonna help you because there's something wrong with you, we're gonna help you get through Drake, we said, oh, you know what, we're gonna resource redistribute to you in the form of tuition, in the form of extra faculty and staff support, not to help fill the deficit, because we know you don't have the deficit. As a way of, those faculty and staff like me, we're gonna run interference for you. We're gonna find the places as much as we can where racial harms are happening, and we're gonna take that on so you have a space where you can just thrive and be excellent students, because we know you're excellent students. And so I think of that as a repair-based model, because the institution has invested significant resources in that program. So it is about money, it transfers resources, but it's been completely aligned with where racial harms have needed to be addressed. And I am just gonna say, the program is 7 years old. The GPA gap is gone for those students, unheard of at predominantly white institutions. And Krewe scholars have a higher graduation rate than the median student at Drake University, which is unheard of at predominantly white institutions for Black and Latino students. And so it's working, and it's a repair-based model as opposed to we spend a lot of time, and it's very counterintuitive for higher ed, saying, no, we're not gonna have these students come in and say, okay, let's sit down and talk to white students about what it's like to be Black. That's what predominantly white institutions like to do. We're like, no, if and when Black students want to talk about that, that is their decision, great. They're here to be students. They're here to get a great education. Their job they're not here to educate white students. Our job is to make sure that we clear out the obstacles to make sure they can excel the way they showed up here ready to go. So it's a really different model, and it's I think an example of a repair-based model where we've assessed the harm, we know where it is, and we've designed and invested resources in redressing that harm, and then we're of course constantly measuring it and assessing and making changes. And it's not perfect, but they still experience a lot of racism. But anyway, so that's a very local example. Des Moines is an example, I think, of the phenomena you're describing, where there was a thriving, mixed income African American community in Des Moines, and then that emerged after the I'm not from Iowa, Fort Bragg? No. What's the fort in Des Moines? Fort Des Moines, maybe. We had some of the first African American military were stationed in Iowa. And so when the war ended, in Des Moines, a thriving mixed income Black community emerged called the Center Street, and it was centered around Center Street. And this filmmaker who's working on this film as we speak, who is amazing, has all these documents and interviews from people who lived on Center Street talking about how in Center Street, that neighborhood, in addition to sort of having a haven of sort of connection and neighborliness, there was incredible Black entrepreneurship where African Americans in the neighborhood in that area were thriving economically through their own, they weren't getting money from white banks, that still was not happening, right? But they had developed their own systems, and there were, this filmmaker recounts doctors and lawyers and working class people all living in this neighborhood that was an amazing music scene. In Des Moines and Center Street, nationally renowned artists would come through. And Des Moines in the 50s just bulldozed it in the urban renewal process. And then not that long thereafter, like so many cities, took federal funds and built the interstate right smack dab in the middle of it. And there's folks in Des Moines who lived in that community that still live there, that still live in Des Moines, which also means, I'm a transplant, but my partner's family, they've been in Des Moines for generations. Every time I hear the story, I'm like, what was her family doing? And and the kind of economic divestment that has devastated, as I'm coming to understand from my my friends and fellow activists who are in that work, who are part of that community, like there's all these like economic dead zones in the city where most African Americans in Des Moines live, not because African American Des Moines are entrepreneurial, but because of the zoning and the divestment and it's decimating to a community's ability to thrive. So there's a group of us that have been starting to talk about, okay, could we do a truth and repair process around that? This is recent history in Des Moines. These are our neighbors. Bricks from buildings that, folks had used to build their businesses. The city knocked them down, and now those bricks, people who now live in the suburbs, have them in their yards for their landscaping. They're white neighbors, And so could we do repair around that? I don't know. Some of us are trying to get our heads together and start to explore those questions. These kinds of repair questions are pressing everywhere in this country. I do. So the models I have are not sort of all the way along, because this is sort of new emerging initiatives that are transpiring. But when I just got to write a appendix to Dear White Christians, the book one of the books Laura held up, because the publisher wants to reissue it next year, and they wanted examples, and there are some now. One is, I just read about this church in Asheville, North Carolina. It's a United Church of Christ, and it's a predominantly white congregation, and they know that the land that they are on, and they've done the research, is of course the traditional homelands of the Cherokee people. And so when this church was 10 years old, which was this year, actually, this is very underway, part of their celebration of their 10 years was to do this research on whose land their church is actually built. And they made a public commitment through, they've been bringing people on board. They didn't just sort of throw this out there to the universe. They've been working with the parish to sort of understand this legacy and why it matters as Christians that they are on land that is really land that was treaty stolen land, land of broken treaty, where treaties were broken. They have publicly committed in the next 2 years to a 3-part, I might get this a little bit wrong because it's such a new learning for me, but now if you go to their website, they publicly pay homage to the peoples whose land their church is on, and they now talk about the land we are using instead of saying our land. And then they committed to, in the next year, right away, they've engaged Cherokee leaders and other Native peoples in the area to offer space in the buildings and such that they own, where Native peoples can use the space free of charge, of course, and engage in various kinds of ancestral work and healing work, and in a very sort of autonomous way, not with the church looking over their shoulder what they're doing, just like, our building is on your land, the least we can do is, here, do you need a space? The second thing they've committed to doing is, by the end of the year, engaging Cherokee leaders in particular about the ways that I think maybe even their land title and some of their resources in the church can be in partnership and sort of in a posture of repentance and repair, respond to how Cherokee leaders would talk about what it would mean to differently honor that legacy and acknowledge that legacy as a church. So I'm messing that part up a lot because I can't quite remember what it said. And then the third piece was, they committed to establishing a reparations fund that African American and Native peoples and groups can access funding for to do projects and initiatives that are Black and Native led for the good and well-being of Black and Native peoples. And I don't know how big the fund is or how far off the ground it is, but they've made a public commitment to that. And they're calling all of it reparations. So we'll see where that goes in 2 or 3 years, but that's an example of something a church has done. A different example is has emerged in the Episcopal Church, where they're engaged in a national, now they're calling it reconciliation, but about 10 years ago they started calling it reparations, and the Diocese of Maryland was very involved, a biracial group of people, black Christians and white Christians together. First, they started meeting in 2001 as Episcopalians who didn't know each other, some of whom were hostile to the idea of reparations at all, but they made a commitment to research the histories of churches, parishes in their diocese, and who built the buildings, which in Maryland is all enslaved African peoples built those buildings. And so then after they did that difficult work together, they then made a commitment to go, and they went parish to parish and taught the communities in the parishes about who had engaged those communities in learning about the histories of their own buildings, which was very difficult work, but they did it over a period of years, and it started to change the climate in the diocese, because their experience, and this has been true in my experiences, is when we start to tell the histories, folks' resistance tends to decrease, because a lot of times resistance to something like repair reparations is because we actually don't know the story. When we hear the story, sometimes we go, oh my gosh. And then, so then in the diocese, they've been having diocese-wide conversations about what to do with these legacies, and they've been doing ritualized kind of work where they've done what they call the Trail of Souls, and they've been going through the diocese once a year, I think in November, and paying homage and doing pilgrimage to name the African peoples who built the buildings where they know names, and where they don't know names, to engage in Christian ritualized practices around that. And they stream them so that people don't have physical mobility can all participate. And then they're also, like, I don't think this passed, but somebody out of all this work said, okay, now we're gonna put forth a bill where we're saying, in the diocese, 10% of all offerings is gonna go to a reparations fund. We're just gonna say 10% off the top. And I don't know where that work is. I'm not sure that passed, but that's the kind of thing that is emerging there. And it's not just emerging because it's not been fast work. They've been working on this since 2001, but they've changed the collective self-understanding in the diocese enough that there's kind of a political will, if you will, for readiness for those kinds of next steps. And it started with them by getting to dig into the history. And what was amazing I'll tell you the last thing I'll say about this work in Maryland, is that this committee that met to begin this work, who I got to sit down with for a couple of days and do interviews with back in 2010, I think, or 11, they actually, here I was thinking about what's failed us about reconciliation. This was the most interracially reconciled group of Christians I've ever been around, which is counterintuitive, because they convened as a reparations task force, and one of the white priests on the task force had gotten himself on it because he was so mad that they were doing a reparations task force. And he became totally converted to the idea of reparations through doing the historical work. And these black and white Christians in that little community had become, like, in the most deepest way possible, like brothers and sisters, because they had done that shared historical work together. And it was so counterintuitive, but I was like, oh, they're doing the work of repair, and as a result, they're ending up reconciled to one another. And it was so amazing to me to see that live and in person. So those are a couple of church examples. The 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times has been doing, this person is saying this 1619 Project, which is coming out, right? I mean, I've been listening to it on podcast. The last episode's about to come out this week, but it's also in written form, is recovering and telling a lot of the story of Black America, basically, and in a very, so many of us got really deeply sanitized versions of the history of enslavement, and this project, she's doing an amazing job both of describing that in such powerfully truth-telling ways, and also really just disclosing how African Americans are the heart of America in terms of all the things, labor and music, and I'm not all the way through it, but yeah, I mean, convening forums where we hear those stories, like Jones's unearthing in 1619. She's from Iowa. She's from Waterloo, that journalist. I would love to know what folks here think about that question as well. What questions should we be asking? I think the two things I think we should be asking, you know, I feel excited that Democratic candidates are using the word reparations, even if they don't, you know, I don't expect that to go anywhere, but I think that for that word to be uttered is a kind of progress that's important, and it reflects lots of community organizing that's been happening for decades across the country. So, but I think really asking the candidates questions around that invoke the language of race around issues of peace and justice is really important. So for example, questions that when you know, especially when folks are talking about you know, the wealth gap and the crisis, the economic crisis, where so, you know, 1 or 2% of the, you know, the people own however, you know, whatever obscene amount it is, and so many of us are not thriving. When candidates are talking about things like that, asking them, okay, and how do you think about the different, you know, we have poverty and we also have like poverty, you know, racialized poverty. Questions that invite and challenge candidates to be really specific about the racial disparities whenever we're talking about issues of class, which I am also excited candidates are talking about. Those kinds of questions that really ask them to speak to that, I think, are really important to you know, not just bringing them along, but also bringing the communities along who hear us ask those questions, you know. I had a conversation with Kathy Glasson when she was running for governor a couple years ago, and I said to her, I said, I wonder, what do you think about reparations? You know, I was just, you know, and she actually had a really, I shouldn't say actually as if I was surprised, she had a really, really thoughtful response about that question. So I'm certainly not, I do think at some moments that's a really, it's a good question to ask, especially anytime we show that there's white folks, even if it's to our edge, that white folks are willing to sort of push our edges to, like, reparations is not a loaded word for black people. It's a loaded word for white people. And so, I mean, that's an oversimplification. It is a loaded word for some African Americans, but it's mostly white folks who have resistance to that word. So I actually think it's a pretty powerful political act to simply ask the question as a white person, as a white body in a room, because even if for just a moment, it breaks down that notion that it's only people of color that are interested in our past history and how it's impacting the present. Having said that, I also think you're right. It's difficult for candidates to talk about it, in part because I suspect, I'm not sure how many of them have really thought deeply about it, I don't know. But I also think, I mean, I know this from working on issues of reparations for a long time in educational contexts. It takes a long time. Like we have to bring people along. And so it's sometimes not helpful in a moment to just drop that word. If you, like, white folks need to be sort of cultivated into understanding what that is we're even talking about. And that's not a defense of that reality, but that is the reality. And so I think it's really difficult because politicians who are running for office they're not staying to like engage in a nurturing process around helping to understand what truth-telling looks like, you know, and they don't have time to talk about, you know, there's no statute of limitations on human rights violations, which is what enslavement was, you know, like by international law, if we believe in international law, we owe reparations. There's no question about that. Like, but the candidates aren't, you know, so I think it's complicated, but I do think it helps me think about how community mobilization and activism matters, because you know, that word is coming up because people have been working on raising awareness around repair and reparations for a very, very long time, and there's some mobilization that's making it harder for candidates not to speak it. There's all kinds of thinking out there. Oh yeah, and there's not a box, definitely. So there's groups like NCORE have just really brilliant models that do involve, again, like I always want to be wary of saying it's not about money, because it is about redistributing resources. But for example, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which has been thinking and, you know, powerful scholars involved in this work, they've done everything from, they articulate a platform that says things like, okay, if we know that the harms of enslavement, what the official language is vestiges of slavery, the way slavery is still hanging around, right? Because of course it wasn't just enslavement, then it was Jim Crow, then it was lynching, then it was, right, not getting pensions and unions and all of it. Vestiges of slavery has been multi-generational. Reparations, thus, isn't about, for almost any reparations group, it's not about African Americans getting a check. That's very few advocate that model because that would not address the structural systemic exploitation and power. So African Americans who advocate for reparations are talking about resource redistribution that would create structural shifting of power and resources. So everything from, like, for example, free healthcare. One of the ongoing racial harms of the history of enslavement shows up in statistics around black health. Reparations could meaningfully move the needle on repairing the harm of the history of enslavement by pouring resources into making sure that as part of reparations, the human rights violations the United States committed against African peoples, African Americans got access to free health care for 2 generations or 3 generations. That's an example. That would be a resource investment that had a structural impact and would impact outcomes and the well-being and quality of life of future generations. Education would be another area. That kind of resource redistribution could happen in a very, I mean, not easy, but in a very easy way. It's not, most groups aren't talking about, like, okay, if I, as a white person, have a house, you know, and my grandma got the house because she could apply for a federal housing loan when African Americans were disbarred from that, not allowed to do that, that I have to give back the money from that house. Very few reparations platforms look like that. It's about things like, no, 5 generations of no more income taxes for black people. Like, that might be a little, that wouldn't get us close to the wages that were, you know, exploited from their labor that built the economy of the United States, but it would be a multi-generational, impactful, meaningful act that wouldn't even take an outlay of cash, right? It would be a repair adjustment that would redistribute resources, but no check transfer. So those are some examples. There's a ton of amazing thinking out there about it. Even the Black Manifesto, which I mentioned to you all, has this amazing specific list of how they were going to use the $500 million. And if you read it today, you're like, oh yeah, if we did all that, that would shift power. It's like, you know, however many millions of dollars to create black-owned media outlets. It's access to higher education. It's, I mean, so there's like all the areas of black life where there's disparity that we absolutely can trace to the history of enslavement. We need to redress and repair that. And that would be what a reparations package might do. But you get there by also starting with collective truth-telling, where you get more and more and more and more Americans to hear the story. So it'd probably need to be like congressional hearings or something like that. Unless something happened in a local context. So if we did something like that in Des Moines, it'd be like, we would have lots of public forums talking about what happened to Center Street and where those bricks went, and figuring out how we get the bricks back, you know. Friends, you've been sitting a long time. I'm so deeply grateful again for having been invited, thank you. And I'm happy to talk further with anyone who wants to chat. And there's cookies. I am happy to talk more with anyone as long as I can eat a cookie while I do it. So I want to thank you so much for engaging me with such an open heart and on such an important an important sort of honoring of the peace movement and the work that, I'm sure I'll get to hear more about the amazing work that you all have already been part of and continue to be part of. So thanks again for hosting me. Thanks.